Smoke rolled off the stone bridge in thick black coils, and SS Untersturmführer Fritz Langanke could not see 30 meters ahead of his Panther. What he could hear told him enough: steel grinding against masonry, the low moan of a hull burning from the inside. And behind him, stretching back into the dark tree line along the road, 11 more Panthers and a mixed bag of half-tracks and Panzer Grenadiers, all of them going absolutely nowhere on Christmas Eve, 1944. A single American M4 Sherman sat wedged across the bridge approach at an angle that looked almost deliberate, its hull torn open by at least 2 penetrating hits, flames licking out of the commander's hatch, and the whole burning carcass blocking the only crossing point wide enough for armor in this stretch of the valley. One tank, one bridge, one column stopped cold. This channel keeps running because people like the ones watching right now make it happen. If this story hooks something in the back of the brain, a like and a subscribe go further than most people think. And drop a comment. Name a battle, name a unit, name some strange detail from the war that nobody talks about. That's where the best scripts come from. Langanke's driver had already killed the engine. No point burning fuel, while the pioneers figured out whether they could shove 32 tons of wrecked Sherman off a medieval bridge without collapsing the span underneath it. The village, and sources conflict on exactly which village, because the German after-action reports from this stretch of the Ardennes offensive are a mess of contradictory grid references, sat in a narrow river valley where the road funneled down to a single stone crossing. Typical terrain for the region. Rolling hills, dense forest on either side, and then these little bottleneck towns built around a bridge or a ford that had been there since the Middle Ages. The kind of place a military planner glances at on a map and marks as a choke point. The kind of place one crew with one tank and enough nerve could turn into a wall. And one crew did. Langanke's column belonged to the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, and on the night of December 24th, they had fuel for maybe another 40 kilometers if they kept moving. They did not keep moving. The operational timeline for the entire Ardennes counteroffensive ran on hours, not days, and every hour parked behind a burning Sherman on a bridge too narrow to bypass bled the schedule dry. The Germans needed speed. They needed to punch through the thin American screening positions before reinforcements consolidated. Hitler's entire gamble in the West depended on tempo. Reach the Meuse crossings before the Allies could react, split the British from the Americans, force a negotiated settlement. That plan required panzer columns flowing through gaps like water, not stacking up behind roadblocks in villages whose names most of the tank commanders couldn't pronounce. So how did one M4, a tank the Germans openly mocked for its thin armor and its tendency to catch fire, a silhouette that stood too tall on the horizon, managed to freeze an elite SS formation in place? The short answer involves a crew that understood geometry better than they understood self-preservation. The longer answer reaches back into how American tankers actually fought in the hedgerow country and the winter forests, not the way doctrine prescribed, but the way experience demanded. To understand why Langanke sat in his turret on Christmas Eve watching pioneers try to winch a burning wreck off a 500-year-old bridge, the story has to rewind about 12 hours to a briefing in a cold farmhouse where an American platoon sergeant made a decision that looked suicidal on paper. But the bridge comes first. The span measured roughly 4.5 meters across, wide enough for a Sherman, barely wide enough for a Panther, and absolutely not wide enough for a Panther to squeeze past a Sherman carcass, wedged diagonally against the stone railings. German combat engineers estimated 2 to 3 hours to clear the obstruction. They did not have 2 to 3 hours. Langanke's after-action account, compiled later as part of the Foreign Military Studies series, where former Wehrmacht and SS officers wrote sanitized versions of their wartime experiences for American historians, uses a phrase that translates roughly to an operationally decisive delay caused by a single enemy vehicle. Their phrasing, not mine. An entire panzer column's schedule shattered by one tank that most German crewmen considered inferior to anything they drove. The Panther weighed 44.5 tons. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges the Sherman couldn't answer. On open ground, in a straight duel, the mathematics favored the Germans, and everyone on both sides knew it. Langanki's crews had trained for exactly that kind of engagement. Identify, range, fire, advance. Clean armored warfare, as the Panzerwaffe had practiced it since France in 1940. Nobody trained for this. Nobody wrote a manual chapter on what to do when the enemy sacrifices a tank like a chess piece to physically plug a bridge. The German advantage in firepower, optics, armor thickness. None of it mattered when the battlefield shrank to a space 4.5 meters wide, and the enemy had already decided the exchange rate of one Sherman for 12 hours of panzer paralysis worked in his favor. German tank crews had a nickname for the Sherman by the autumn of 1944. They called it the Brennender Sarg, the burning coffin. They said it openly, in letters home, in mess hall conversation, in the bugged holding cells at Trent Park where British intelligence recorded every word. The contempt ran deep and it ran early. After the first major encounters in North Africa and Sicily, Wehrmacht armor assessments treated the M4 as a solved problem. Too tall, too thin-skinned, armed with a 75mm gun that struggled against the frontal plate of a Panzer IV at anything beyond close range, let alone a Tiger or a Panther. One Panzer officer captured in Normandy told his cellmate, on tape, neither man knowing the microphones existed, that fighting Shermans felt like shooting at furniture. That quote circulated through Allied intelligence channels. It stung because it contained a grain of operational truth. The M4's original 75mm M3 gun fired a round that could not reliably penetrate a Panther's glacis plate at any combat range. The numbers are not ambiguous. Ballistic testing confirmed it. American ordnance knew it. Crews in the field learned it the worst way possible, by watching rounds spark off sloped armor and then dying in the return fire. By the summer of 1944, the improved 76mm gun had started arriving in theater, but distribution lagged behind demand, and even the 76 struggled against Panther frontal armor beyond 500 meters. The Germans tracked these engagements meticulously. Their after-action reports from Normandy read like a shooting gallery log. Shermans engaged, Shermans destroyed, losses minimal. A Panzer-Lehr Division summary from July 1944 lists 14 Shermans knocked out in a single afternoon engagement near St. Lo, against the loss of one Panzer IV with repairable track damage. On paper, the Sherman looked like a death trap with a Ford engine. The German analysis broke at exactly this point. They measured the tank, but never the thinking behind it. American armored doctrine coming out of the Normandy hedgerows had undergone a mutation that no German intelligence section caught in time. The original tank destroyer doctrine, tanks don't fight tanks, that's what TD battalions are for, had collided with reality in the bocage and shattered. What replaced it grew from the ground up, platoon by platoon, in the field, without waiting for Fort Knox to write a revised manual. Sergeants and lieutenants who survived June and July figured out something the German reports completely missed. The Sherman did not need to win a duel if it never fought one. Restrictive terrain, hedgerows, village streets, river crossings, forest roads, turned every engagement into a geometry problem. And geometry problems have solutions that don't require a bigger gun. A brief detour on the gun itself, because it matters for what comes later. The 75mm M3 that armed most Shermans in the European theater descended from a French design, the Canon de 75 Model 1897, the famous French 75 of World War I, adapted through several iterations into a tank weapon. By 1944, it fired a high-explosive round that could demolish a building and an armor-piercing round that could not demolish a Panther. The same gun. Devastating against infantry and fortifications, inadequate against late-war German armor. This mattered because American crews learned to choose their ammunition based on what they intended to do with the terrain, not what they intended to do to the enemy tank. Anyway, back to the hedgerows and what they taught. The lesson came down to clock and geometry. A Sherman positioned hull down behind a stone wall at a crossroads did not need to penetrate a Panther. It needed to be there, visible, threatening, forcing the Panther commander to stop, assess, deploy infantry, attempt a flanking movement through terrain that might be mined, might be covered by a second Sherman, might hide a bazooka team in a cellar window, might funnel his column into a kill zone he couldn't see. Every minute spent on that decision tree bled the German timetable. American tankers started thinking in minutes, not kills. The platoon sergeant who positioned a Sherman at a bridge approach or a road junction understood, sometimes without articulating it, that he converted 32 tons of steel into time. And time, in December 1944, cost the Germans more than tanks did. The records from the Ardennes fighting show this pattern repeating across dozens of small engagements that never made it into the big histories. A single Sherman, or a pair of Shermans at a choke point, fighting not to win, but to delay. Sometimes the crew survived, often they didn't. The exchange rate, one Sherman and its 5-man crew for 6, 8, 12 hours of German paralysis, looked obscene from the inside of the turret and looked like a bargain from the Corps headquarters map. German intelligence never produced an assessment that recognized this shift. Their reports kept counting kills. Sherman destroyed. Sherman destroyed. The same line repeated down the page until the tallies climbed and the analysts concluded American armor posed no serious threat to a well-handled panzer formation. What the tallies didn't capture, couldn't capture, sat in the columns marked time and phase line and fuel consumed while stationary. A destroyed Sherman that delayed a Kampfgruppe for half a day had accomplished more than a surviving Sherman that withdrew without contact. The crew that plugged Langanki's bridge understood this arithmetic. Whether they learned it in Normandy, in the autumn fighting along the Siegfried Line, or in a freezing farmhouse 12 hours before Christmas Eve, the records don't say. What the records do show is the decision itself and the clock that started ticking the moment Langanki's column ground to a halt behind a burning coffin that refused to move. The Ardennes sits between the Meuse and the Rhine like a crooked spine of forest and ravine that nobody in their right mind would choose for a blitzkrieg. The Germans chose it twice. The first time, in May 1940, it worked because the French didn't believe armor could push through the dense woods and steep river valleys fast enough to matter. They believed wrong, and France fell in 6 weeks. The second time, in December 1944, the German General Staff banked on that same disbelief, that the Americans, like the French before them, would leave the Ardennes thinly held because the terrain looked impassable for large-scale armored operations. They got the thin part right. The Americans had stretched 4 divisions across a front that doctrine said required 12, but the conclusion the Germans drew from that gap, that speed would carry them through before resistance hardened, ignored something the French in 1940 never had time to learn. Americans adapted to terrain faster than any army the Wehrmacht had faced. The river system told the whole story. The Amblève runs west through a valley so narrow in places that the road hugs one bank and the forest drops straight to the waterline on the other. The Somme cuts north-south through similar country. Steep wooded slopes, stone villages clustered at crossing points, bridges built for ox carts and farm trucks now expected to carry 50-ton King Tigers. The Our, the Clerve, the Warsch. Every tributary created another bottleneck, another place where a column compressed from march formation into single file and crawled across a span that might hold 2 vehicles abreast if the drivers held their breath. German operational planning for Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes counteroffensive, acknowledged these bottlenecks in the abstract. The planning maps showed phase lines that assumed each river crossing would cost between 30 minutes and 2 hours, depending on whether the bridge survived Allied demolition. Engineers attached to the lead Kampfgruppen carried bridging equipment, pioneers trained for rapid assault crossings. On paper, the timeline accounted for obstacles. What it did not account for, could not account for, because the planning happened in offices far from the frozen woods, ran deeper than blown bridges. A demolished bridge costs hours. A blocked bridge costs the same hours, plus the maddening knowledge that the span still stands, intact, usable, right there, if only the burning wreck squatting on it would disappear. German pioneers carried explosives to breach obstacles and pontoons to replace destroyed crossings. They did not carry equipment optimized for dragging a 32-ton steel carcass off a medieval stone arch under fire, in the dark, with the temperature dropping below zero, and the nearest recovery vehicle stuck 4 kilometers back in a column that couldn't move because the bridge ahead remained blocked. A standing bridge jammed by a dead tank created a worse problem than no bridge at all, because a missing bridge triggered a rehearsed drill. Deploy pontoons, establish crossing site, resume movement. A plugged bridge triggered nothing. No doctrine covered it. Pioneers improvised with cables and half-tracks and hand signals in the dark, while officers screamed about the timetable. The village streets amplified every delay. Belgian Ardennes villages grew up around their crossings. A church, a handful of stone houses, a road that bent 90 degrees to meet the bridge approach. Armor could not bypass through the buildings. Armor could not cross the river upstream, because the banks dropped 3 meters to the water in most places, and the mud would swallow a panther to its fenders. The only way forward ran through the village, across the bridge, and out the far side. A corridor sometimes no wider than 6 meters, lined with stone walls that channeled any vehicle into a shooting gallery for anyone with a bazooka, a mine, or a tank parked at the right angle. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army's main effort, the unit that Langanke's column supported, hit this geometry over and over in the first 72 hours. Stavelot, Trois-Ponts, Freyneux, La Glaise, each name a river crossing, each crossing a choke point that drained fuel and daylight. At Trois-Ponts, American engineers from the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion blew the bridges over the Amblève and the Somme, literally, as Peiper's lead vehicles approached. The charges detonated with German armor close enough to feel the concussion through their hulls. Peiper's own account, recorded after his capture in the FMS series, describes the moment at Trois-Ponts as the instant he understood the operation had failed, not because he lost tanks, because he lost the road network. Every bridge denied forced a detour down secondary tracks that added hours and burned fuel his column could not replace. The 51st Engineers at Trois-Ponts get the glory in most accounts, and they earned it. But the pattern extended across the entire front. Small American units, engineers, tank platoons, scratch groups of stragglers, organized by some sergeant who grabbed everyone within shouting distance, fought for bridges the way other armies fought for hilltops. Hold it or break it. If the enemy reaches it first, plug it with anything available. A Sherman hull, a truck full of rubble, felled trees wired with mines, a disabled half-track shoved sideways. The material hardly mattered. What mattered sat on the German side of the equation. A panzer column with fuel for 40 more kilometers, a schedule that allowed 0 deviation, and a bridge it could see but could not use. The fuel gauges kept dropping. Somewhere in the dark behind Langanke's idling Panther, the operational timeline for the entire Ardennes gamble bled out through a 4.5-meter gap on a stone bridge that one American crew had turned into a wall. 16 tons. That figure shows up in the maintenance logs for the M4A3 Sherman. The dry weight of the hull alone, stripped of turret, engine, and the 270 rounds of 75mm ammunition crammed into the sponson racks in the floor. Add the turret, the power plant, the tracks, a full combat load, and 5 men who hadn't slept in 2 days, and the number climbed past 32 tons. Enough mass to plug a stone archway built when the Duchy of Luxembourg still answered to the Habsburgs. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division had arrived in the sector around Bastogne on December 18th, 6 days before Langanke's column stacked up behind that burning hull, and spent the intervening time doing exactly what the small units across the Ardennes front had already learned to do. They fed Shermans into choke points like coins into a slot machine, except the payout ran in hours instead of francs. The positions around Neuville and Longueville got the attention in most histories. The fighting along the River Aisne near Freyneux didn't. Combat Command B split its armor into task forces: Team Cherry, Team Desabry, Team O'Hara. each built around a core of medium tanks reinforced with infantry, tank destroyers, and whatever artillery the division could spare. Team Cherry drew the sector that included the river crossings south and east of the main Bastogne perimeter, and by December 23rd, its forward elements held a scattered line of roadblocks across 3 villages and 2 bridge sites. The positioning followed the pattern the hedgerow veterans had drilled into every platoon leader who survived Normandy. Find the narrowest point, put a tank in it, make the enemy solve a problem that costs him time he doesn't have. At Freyneux, the bridge crossed the Aisne through a cut in the valley floor, where the road bent hard left before straightening toward the span. A Sherman from the 3rd Tank Battalion sat just west of the approach, angled to cover the road with its bow machine gun, and the bridge itself with its main armament. The positioning meant the 75 faced the bridge at a range of maybe 80 meters, close enough that penetration tables stopped mattering. Anything crossing that span would eat a round before its driver finished the turn. Langanki's Panzer Grenadiers tried the bridge on foot first. Standard procedure. Dismounted infantry clears the far bank. Armor follows. SS troopers from the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment moved down the east bank in squad-strength groups sometime after dark on the 23rd, using the tree line for concealment, aiming to rush the span and establish a foothold on the western side. The Sherman crew, and the gunner's name does not appear in any surviving record from the 3rd Tank Battalion's after-action report, which is incomplete for this period, opened up with the hull-mounted 30 caliber machine gun at a range the loader could have covered with a thrown rock. The M1919. A 4 belt-fed Browning fired at a cyclic rate of around 400 to 550 rounds per minute, depending on the specific weapon's condition and the cold's effect on the action spring. A tangent on that machine gun, because it carries an odd footnote. The M1919 descended from John Browning's 1917 water-cooled design, which he demonstrated to the Army by firing it continuously for 48 minutes, over 20,000 rounds, without a stoppage. The air-cooled A4 variant that went into the Sherman's hull mount sacrificed that endurance for weight savings, but in short bursts at close range against exposed infantry on a bridge with no cover, endurance hardly mattered. What mattered? The gun could sweep a 4.5-meter-wide bridge like a broom, back to the river. The first attempt to rush the span broke apart in under 2 minutes. German survivors pulled back into the trees on the east bank and called for direct fire support. Langanki's Panthers moved forward to engage, but the road geometry created the same problem it created everywhere in the Ardennes. The column could only bring 1 vehicle to bear at a time, and that vehicle announced itself with engine noise and clanking tracks long before it cleared the tree line. The Sherman crew put a high-explosive round into the road junction east of the bridge, scattering rubble across the approach and forcing the lead Panther to slow through debris in the dark. Another round followed. Then another. None of these rounds could kill a Panther frontally, and the crew knew it. They fired anyway, because every round forced a reaction that cost seconds, and those seconds accumulated into the minutes that bled the schedule. Langanki pulled his column back. The after-action summary describes the decision in clipped language. The bridge approach could not be forced without unacceptable delay to the timetable. His Panthers turned south, searching for a fording point where the Aisne ran shallow enough to cross without bridging equipment. They found one roughly 3 kilometers downstream, but the banks required engineering work, cutting the slope, laying logs for traction, guiding 44-ton vehicles down a muddy grade in darkness with no room for error. The crossing consumed between 4 and 6 hours, depending on which German account gets the benefit of the doubt. Sources give different timestamps for the lead vehicle reaching the West Bank. The gap between the earliest and latest estimate spans nearly 90 minutes, 4 to 6 hours. A single Sherman and a machine gun that a 78-year-old design made possible held that bridge long enough. By the time Langanki's Panthers reached the far side of the Aisne and reformed into something resembling a fighting column, the fuel situation had crossed from concerning into critical. Every liter burned idling at a riverbank or crawling through an improvised ford, subtracted directly from the kilometers remaining before the column died in place. The Meuse crossings sat 50 kilometers west. The fuel gauges said otherwise. So did the spearhead of the entire German counteroffensive die at a bridge over the Amblève, the same way Langanki's column died at a bridge over the Aisne. The answer sits in the fuel logs, and the fuel logs don't leave room for argument. Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled west on December 17th with roughly 70,000 liters of fuel distributed across his column. Panthers, King Tigers, half-tracks, trucks, the whole armored fist of the 1st SS Panzer Division's striking power. The plan assumed he would capture American fuel dumps along the route. Not hoped, assumed. The operational timeline for the 6th Panzer Army's drive to the Meuse built captured fuel into the logistics calculus, the way a normal army builds supply depots. Which tells you everything about how seriously the German High Command took its own offensive. They launched the last strategic armored reserve of the Third Reich down forest roads in winter on the assumption that the Americans would leave their gasoline lying around for the taking. Peiper nearly proved them right. His lead elements passed within 1,500 meters of a massive fuel dump near Büllingen on the morning of the 17th. Over 2 million liters sitting in jerry cans stacked along a road. His column took what the lead vehicles could carry and kept moving. They didn't have time to load it all. The timetable, again. Always the timetable, ticking like a bomb wired to every decision Peiper made from that morning forward. Stavelot sat at the intersection of the Amblève Valley and the road network leading northwest toward Werbemont, Huy, and the Meuse bridges. Peiper needed that town, the way a diver needs the surface. No Stavelot bridge meant no route to Werbemont. No Werbemont meant no route to the Meuse, and without the Meuse, the entire Ardennes offensive amounted to a very expensive traffic jam in a Belgian forest. He reached the heights above Stavelot on the evening of December 17th and stopped. This decision haunted him for the rest of his life. A single American squad held the bridge, 13 men from C Company, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, with mines they hadn't finished laying. Peiper's column outnumbered them by a factor that makes the math almost cruel. But his lead drivers reported the road into town looked mined. The bridge approach appeared blocked, and the column had been moving for over 30 hours without rest. Peiper decided to wait for daylight. The panzer crews shut down their engines to conserve fuel. Men slept in their vehicles, with the temperature dropping past -10 Celsius. The vibration of idling Maybach engines, 700 horsepower shaking 44 tons of steel at a frequency that worked into the teeth and the spine, finally stopped, and the silence in the valley must have felt like mercy. It cost him everything. Overnight, the 291st Engineers reinforced. A platoon from the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion arrived. By dawn on the 18th, a force that still numbered fewer than 200 Americans held positions in the stone buildings along Stavelot's main street and on the bluff overlooking the bridge approach. Not enough to stop Peiper, enough to slow him. The difference between those two words, stop and slow, defined the entire Ardennes campaign in miniature, and the Germans never grasped the distinction until it strangled them. Peiper attacked at 8 a.m. on December 18th. His Panthers bulled through the roadblock on the north side of town, grinding over a hasty mine belt that disabled one vehicle and scattered the engineers covering it. SS Panzer Grenadiers cleared the buildings along the main road in brutal room-to-room fighting that lasted the better part of 2 hours. American defenders fell back across the bridge, and Peiper's lead tanks crossed the Amblève by mid-morning. The spearhead rolled northwest toward Trois-Ponts, leaving a rear guard in Stavelot to secure the bridge and, critically, keep the supply route open for the fuel and ammunition convoys following behind the combat elements. Here, the pattern that killed Langanki's column at Freyneux replicated itself at operational scale. American counterattacks hit Stavelot from the north that same afternoon. Elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the Old Hickory Division, a unit that had fought from Normandy to Aachen and carried the kind of institutional aggression that comes from 11 months of continuous combat, pushed into the town with infantry and tank support. The rearguard Peiper left buckled, fighting surged back and forth through streets already filled with rubble and dead. And sometime during the afternoon of December 19th, engineers from the 105th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 202 Engineer Combat Battalion placed charges on the Amblève Bridge at Stavelot and blew it. The detonation severed Peiper's supply line as cleanly as a scalpel. Every drop of fuel, every round of ammunition, every replacement part his column needed to continue west now sat on the wrong side of a broken bridge in a town the Americans controlled. Peiper drove on toward Trois-Ponts with what he carried and nothing more. At Trois-Ponts, the 51st Engineers blew 2 more bridges in his face. He diverted to l'Église. He ran out of fuel on December 24th, Christmas Eve, the same day Langanke's Panthers burned their last reserves crawling through a ford 3 kilometers from a bridge one Sherman had plugged. The parallel isn't poetic, it's structural. An SS Kampfgruppe, built around the best armor the Wehrmacht possessed, crewed by veterans of the Eastern Front, commanded by one of the most aggressive panzer leaders in the German military, and it died not in a tank battle, but in a logistics strangulation, executed by engineers and scratch infantry companies, backed by individual tank crews who understood that a blocked road mattered more than a killed panther. Peiper abandoned his vehicles at l'Église and walked east through the forest with 800 survivors on foot. He left behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and the last realistic chance the German army had of reaching the Meuse. The fuel gauges read 0, and the bridges stayed closed. The burning coffins won. Colonel William Roberts spread a map across the hood of a jeep in Bastogne on the morning of December 19th and drew circles around every bridge in the 10th Armored Division sector. 11 circles. Each one got a task force designation, a tank allocation, and a demolition priority. Roberts had commanded armor in North Africa and Sicily before taking Combat Command B, and the lesson he carried out of those campaigns had nothing to do with tank-on-tank engagements. It had to do with roads. Control the road, and the enemy's firepower becomes furniture, heavy, impressive, and stuck in the wrong room. The 11 circles on Roberts' map represented a method, not a doctrine in the formal sense. Nobody at Fort Knox had published a field manual chapter titled How to Plug a Bridge with a Dead Sherman. The method grew organically out of the hedgerow, fighting in Normandy, where American tankers learned that bocage negated German advantages in exactly the same way Ardennes river crossings did, by compressing the battlefield to a width where numbers and optics and muzzle velocities stopped mattering, and the only question became who controlled the bottleneck. Normandy killed enough Sherman crews to teach the survivors that the tank's greatest value sometimes lived not in its gun, but in its mass. 32 tons of steel parked in a gap, a Panther couldn't bypass, bought more time than 32 tons of steel burning in a field where the Panther had already flanked it. What made the method repeatable? What turned individual acts of stubbornness into a system the Wehrmacht couldn't crack came down to 3 elements the German army either lacked or couldn't coordinate under the conditions of December 1944. First, engineers. The American combat engineer battalions in the Ardennes carried more demolition capability per mile of front than any comparable force in any army on either side of the war. The 291st at Stavelot, the 51st at Trois-Ponts, the 105th and 202 at the Stavelot counterattack, the 299 at Malmedy. Every one of these battalions operated under standing orders that predated the German offensive by months. Prepare all bridges in your sector for demolition. Maintain charges on site. Designate a responsible officer with authority to blow on contact. The standing orders originated from 1st Army Headquarters and filtered down through corps and division engineers with a specificity that bordered on obsessive. Bridge number, charge weight, firing circuit type, name of the officer authorized to give the order. The Germans had pioneers, good ones. But German pioneer doctrine emphasized building crossings for advancing armor, not systematically denying crossings to the enemy across an entire corps front simultaneously. The asymmetry proved fatal. Second, communication. American units in the Ardennes maintained radio contact, fragile, intermittent, sometimes routed through relay stations that a single artillery round could silence, but contact nonetheless. When the 51st Engineers blew the bridges at Trois-Ponts, the report reached 1st Army Headquarters within hours. When Stavelot changed hands, the 30th Division's command post knew before nightfall. This communication allowed a pattern to emerge in real time. The Germans are channeled by terrain. Their fuel is finite. Every bridge denied multiplies the cost of every other bridge denied. Roberts grasped this at the tactical level on the 19th. Gruesome as it sounds, he treated his Shermans as expendable delay mechanisms and his bridges as the actual defended positions. The tank existed to serve the choke point, not the other way around. Third, and this is the element that no German general writing his post-war FMS report could bring himself to fully articulate, the American replacement system fed crews into the line fast enough to make the method sustainable. A Sherman burned at a bridge on Tuesday held a crew that arrived on Wednesday. The tank came from a depot in Liège or Charleroi, drawn from a reserve pool that American factories kept filled at a rate the German war economy hadn't matched since 1942. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division during the Ardennes fighting, wrote in his FMS account that American losses seemed to produce no visible reduction in combat strength. His word, visible. The replacement Shermans appeared at choke points as if the destroyed ones had grown back overnight, and in a sense they had. The logistics chain that ran from Detroit assembly lines through East Coast ports to Channel depots to Belgian railheads delivered tanks the way a municipal system delivers water, continuously, impersonally, and without interruption. The Wehrmacht had no doctrinal answer because the problem couldn't be solved doctrinally. Maneuver warfare requires maneuver space. The Ardennes didn't offer it. Blitzkrieg requires tempo. Bridge denial killed tempo. Combined arms requires concentration of force. 4.5-meter stone archways made concentration irrelevant. The 100th Panther in the column contributed exactly as much combat power as the 1st, exactly 0, because only one vehicle could approach the span at a time, and that vehicle faced a gun already aimed at the only piece of ground it could occupy. Roberts lost tanks at every one of those 11 circles on his map. Crews burned alive in their Shermans. Others bailed out into the snow and fought as infantry until someone found them a ride back to the rear. The 3rd Tank Battalion's strength returns for the last week of December, 1944, show a loss rate that would have crippled a German Panzer battalion permanently. The Americans absorbed it and kept plugging bridges. Langanki's Panthers sat 3 kilometers from a usable crossing and burned fuel they couldn't replace because one crew in one Sherman understood something the entire German operational plan failed to account for. A bridge doesn't care how good your tank is. It only cares how wide the road gets. The Panther's gun mantlet alone weighed more than some American cars rolling off the line in 1943. Krupp cast it from homogeneous nickel-steel armor, 120 millimeters thick at the thickest point, shaped to deflect shot traps away from the turret ring. The 88mm KWK-43 on the King Tiger could penetrate 165 millimeters of rolled armor at 2,000 meters. German optical rangefinders, manufactured by Zeiss, gave Panther gunners a first-round hit probability at combat range that no Allied tank crew could match with comparable equipment. The transmission, well, the transmission broke constantly, but that's another story. The point is that the Third Reich poured the last reserves of its engineering talent, its strategic metals, and what remained of its skilled labor into building the most formidable armored vehicles on any battlefield in 1944, and those vehicles died behind a 32-ton machine that American tankers themselves considered mediocre, parked sideways in a gap the width of a delivery truck. The cosmic joke wrote itself. Nobody needed to add a punchline. Germany spent 4 years refining the Panther into a weapon that could kill a Sherman, at ranges where the Sherman 75 couldn't even scratch the paint. Every improvement, the sloped glacis plate, the long-barreled high-velocity gun, the wide tracks for soft ground, addressed the problem of destroying enemy armor in open-field engagements. The Waffenamt engineers in Berlin optimized for the duel. Muzzle velocity, armor slope, optical clarity, turret traverse speed. They built a fencing foil when the Americans brought a doorstop. The Sherman didn't need to penetrate a Panther's front plate at Freyneux. It needed to weigh 32 tons and catch fire in the right place. The 75mm gun mattered only insofar as it forced approaching vehicles to stop and think, and thinking consumed minutes, and minutes consumed fuel, and fuel represented the one commodity the German war machine could not manufacture fast enough to replace what the Ardennes swallowed in a week. How did the Wehrmacht's own officers process this after the war? Carefully. The FMS reports written between 1946 and 1951 contain thousands of pages of analysis from German generals and staff officers explaining what went wrong, and the explanations lean heavily on weather, Hitler's interference, fuel shortages, and Allied air superiority, all real factors. But the reports circle around a truth that most of the authors couldn't state directly, because stating it would have invalidated the professional framework they'd built careers on. The American Army didn't need a superior tank. It needed an adequate tank in adequate numbers, positioned by men who understood that terrain trumped technology when the terrain cooperated. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, came closest. His FMS narrative acknowledges that American blocking positions along river crossings imposed delays wholly disproportionate to the forces employed. Disproportionate, a polite word for humiliating. Von Manteuffel commanded the formation that should have taken Bastogne. His Panthers outnumbered the Shermans in the 10th Armored Division sector by a margin that made the tactical math straightforward. On paper, the math assumed his Panthers could reach the Shermans. The bridges said otherwise. Stone spans plugged by burning hulls, approach roads cratered by engineer charges, fords that caused 6 hours of darkness and 300 liters of irreplaceable fuel, each one subtracted from a budget that started insufficient and shrank by the hour. Von Manteuffel's offensive didn't fail because American tanks outfought his Panthers. It failed because American tanks outsat them. The Sherman crews at those bridges traded their lives for hours, the way a man trades currency, knowing the exchange rate and spending what they had. The replacement pipeline kept the account solvent. Bayerlein's observation about American losses, producing no visible reduction in combat strength, applied with particular venom to the bridge blocking tactic, because the tactic consumed Shermans at a rate that should have been unsustainable. A tank destroyed per bridge per day meant the 10th Armored Division needed a constant flow of hulls from the rear, and the hulls came. They arrived on flatbed trucks from depots that drew from ports, that drew from convoys, that drew from factories running 3 shifts in Detroit, and the Germans had no equivalent chain. Every Panther lost at a blocked crossing represented an irreplaceable subtraction from a force that entered the Ardennes, already below authorized strength. Every Sherman lost represented a Tuesday. The cold snap broke on December 26th. Skies cleared. P-47s from the 362nd and 405th Fighter Groups hit every road in the German salient, carrying 500-pound bombs and napalm. And the columns that had spent a week crawling through chokepoints became columns burning in the open. But the air attacks finished what the bridges started. The panzers stalled before the first thunderbolt rolled in. Terrain denial, executed by engineers and individual tank crews operating on standing orders and institutional stubbornness, had already broken the timetable beyond recovery. The Luftwaffe's absence mattered less than the road's narrowness, and the road's narrowness mattered less than the 5 Americans sitting inside a steel box in the coldest December Belgium had recorded in a decade, aiming a machine gun at a span they knew they'd never leave. On December 27th, a replacement crew from the 3rd Tank Battalion picked up a fresh M4A3 at a depot outside Neufchâteau, drove it to a crossroads south of Bastogne, and parked it covering a bridge over a frozen creek. The crew commander, a staff sergeant whose name appears in the unit diary only as Kowalski S., radioed his position report and asked if resupply would include hot rations. The answer came back negative. Kowalski reportedly keyed his handset one more time and said, "Figures."